All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're unpacking a brand new, highly critical report that evaluates the first year of the Prabowo Gibran administration in Indonesia. Whether you've been closely tracking Indonesian politics or you're just fascinated by how emerging economies handle power transitions, this explainer is going to break down the data and the arguments presented by a massive civil society coalition.
So, what's the big takeaway from the authors of this analysis? Well, they claim the administration has been rapidly centralizing both economic and political power over the last 12 months. The coalition's core argument is that the government is essentially using military discipline to steer the state, moving towards what they call a totalitarian command economy. And if true, that's a huge structural shift away from the democratic reforms the country has spent literally decades building.
It's a really provocative thesis, right? The evaluation contends that this rapid centralization of power is primarily serving political insiders and oligarchs, rather than everyday people. And these policies, they've actually sparked protests on the streets. We're seeing citizens out there holding banners, demanding a real fight against cartels and oligarchy that are disguised as political parties.
To unpack all these heavy claims methodically, we're breaking this explainer down into 5 key pillars. First, a critical first year. Second, the military and civilian spheres. Third, policies and patronage. Fourth, the extractivism trap. And finally, a fragile economy.
Section 1. A critical first year. The coalition's perspective. Let's start by looking at exactly who is actually making these sweeping evaluations about Indonesia's democracy.
You see, this isn't just some random op-ed. This 74-page analysis was collaboratively put together by a major coalition of prominent Indonesian civil society groups. We're talking about heavy hitters like Transparency International Indonesia, Indonesia Corruption Watch, and the Legal Aid Institute. Because of the history and weight these organizations carry, we really need to look objectively at their data to understand what they're signaling about the state of the nation.
Section 2. Military and civilian spheres. The return to the bureaucracy. Here, the analysis points to a deliberate, systematic expansion of military influence right back into everyday civilian government.
Just think about the timeline from early 2025. It brilliantly illustrates how incredibly fast the administration moved. Within just a tight 3-month window, a whole succession of laws structurally overhauled resource management and military authority. It started with the sudden formation of the Agranas state-owned enterprises in January, followed by mining law revisions in February, and then major changes to the Armed Forces Law in March.
Let's zoom in on that January creation of the Agranas state-owned enterprises. These entities were set up to manage hundreds of thousands of hectares of state land for agriculture. But the thing the NGO coalition really zeroes in on is the leadership. These massive state corporations are predominantly run by retired military generals. According to the authors, this effectively militarizes state agricultural and food security initiatives.
Taking that a step further, a huge focal point of the report is the March 26 revision of the TNI law. This legal update now allows active soldiers to hold positions across 14 different civilian ministries. And it even extends the retirement age for officers. The coalition forcefully argues that this move essentially reverses the 1998 democratic demilitarization efforts, plugging active military personnel straight back into the executive branch.
Section 3. Policies and Patronage. Distributing state resources. Let's see how all of this builds into what the NGOs describe as an economy of patronage.
The coalition claims that the new mega projects popping up everywhere aren't purely about national development. Instead, they allege these initiatives are basically being used to slice up the national pie among campaign volunteers, political elites, and the president's inner circle. They point to policy decisions that seem to fast-track financial benefits straight to these insiders.
Now, when we look at the data regarding the local implementation of the massive free and nutritious meal program, a really fascinating pattern emerges. The report maps out how foundations tied directly to the ruling party, the president's family, and prominent politicians are the ones actually managing the kitchens for this highly lucrative state-funded initiative across various provinces.
And the financial stakes here are absolutely massive. By October 2025, this meal program had already absorbed 29% of its staggering 71 trillion rupiah budget. Yet the review heavily criticizes the program for rushed and poor implementation. They cite allegations that a lack of proper oversight has actually led to thousands of food poisoning cases among the very students the program is supposed to be helping.
Section 4. The Extractivism Trap. Mining, land, and global demand. Here, the coalition warns of a trap that they argue is being cleverly disguised as a green energy transition.
This is where the narrative really flips. Despite all the global talk about decarbonization and green energy, the data presented suggests Indonesia is actually doubling down on fossil fuels. To support their booming downstream nickel industry, which, by the way, is totally essential for electric vehicle batteries worldwide, the government is planning to build 6.3 gigawatts of new coal power plants by 2034.
To pave the way for this massive industrial push, the NGOs point right back to those sudden February 2025 revisions to the mining law. They argue these updates were deliberately rushed to fast-track permits and sideline environmental oversight. The goal, according to the report, is to easily secure land for what they call strategic national projects, often completely bypassing any local community input.
Section 5. A fragile economy. Macroeconomic realities. So how do these high-level policies and massive state projects actually hit everyday citizens?
One staggering statistic really stands out here: 9 million. 9 million Indonesians have fallen out of the middle class over the past 3 years, and the authors claim this downward mobility is actively accelerating under the current tax policies, as the government scrambles for rapid funding to pay for its ambitious megaprojects.
When you break down the government spending over a 10-year period, the contrast is honestly stark. Consider this: while spending on social protection has increased by 57%, the burden of debt interest has absolutely skyrocketed by an incredible 254%. That really highlights a growing systemic imbalance in the nation's budget priorities.
The overarching takeaway from the authors is that this immense debt, fueled by top-down infrastructure and resource extraction, ultimately empties the wallets of middle-class taxpayers. They're the ones bearing the fiscal burden through increased taxes and levies, but reportedly, they're receiving very little economic stimulus or actual benefit in return.
And this macroeconomic strain isn't just numbers on a page. It's grounded in everyday reality. Bringing it all full circle, despite the billions of rupiahs poured into those military-run agricultural initiatives and food estate projects we talked about earlier, the price of basic staples, especially rice, continues to surge. It's reaching record highs and severely squeezing household budgets.
The NGO coalition actually concludes their highly critical evaluation by quoting the poet Agam Wispy. They view the compounding economic pressures, agrarian conflicts, and centralized control as the exact kind of foundation that could spark widespread grassroots resistance from communities who are just feeling left behind.
Which leaves us with a critical question to consider based on the arguments presented in this report. Does the pursuit of centralized state-driven economic stability justify the sacrifice of democratic freedoms and environmental safeguards? At what point does the cost of this command economy become just too high for democracy to bear? Think about that for a second. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep asking the hard questions.